Okay, much anticipated Fort King Part Two, the second life of the fort, and from 1832 to 1836. If you remember in the previous uh, episode about Fort King, about uh, three vlogs ago, that Fort King was first occupied from 1827 and abandoned two and a half years later in 1839, partly because the government said, we don't have enough money, and government never intended Fort King to be a permanent fort, much to the disagreement of the settlers and the officers of the time. So anyway, in 1832, in May, was the Treaty of Payne's Landing, where the Seminoles negotiated the removal treaty, and some say that was a dishonest treaty, that the Seminoles and Miccosukee people, the Fort Indians, were uh, not given the straight situation, mistranslations, whatever it was. But anyway, the Supreme Court later on said that the treaty was not valid because it uh, was done in, I guess, some fraudulent business, but it was implemented by Andrew Jackson as president anyway. So, following the Treaty of Payne's Landing, Fort King was reoccupied the next month in July. And let's see if, and as far as we know, this is what the fort looked like in the first period, and in the second period, it must have looked like the same thing, because we see a sketch that Lieutenant Henry Prince did. Uh, the fort, it seems to be about the same shape and size. You can see a few more outbuildings there, and looks like there's a building here and maybe over there. That's either a tree or a building, I'm not sure, but this one definitely looks like a building. So one of those would be a blacksmith shop. Says Hammock. There's a road going to the southwest. That's Fort King Road. The other road going south, that goes down into the Indian Reservation. We'll be talking about that particular road later on in part three, or maybe in part four, depends on how far we get. This road going to the north goes about 10 miles to Fort Drane, 30 miles from Fort King is Micanopy. And that's really the only road access they have. They're 3 miles away from the Silver Springs. This is the Okawaha River right down in the corner. I wish I would have expanded it more. It's just a straight JPEG on my PowerPoint that says Fort King. This says Glassell Springs. That's the one of the early names of Silver Springs. Silver River runs into the Okawaha River. You'll see Payne's Landing here. About halfway down, the river opens up, widens up. Uh, Between that first part of the river, that has to be one of the prettiest canoeing stretches in Florida. I canoed that with the scouts back around 1999, 2000. Absolutely beautiful canoe trip. And it makes a big bend where Orange Creek runs into it, from Orange Creek from Fort Russell and Fort Brooke, not the same brook as Fort Tampa. There's actually three Fort Brooks in Florida. And it'll eventually run into the St. Johns River north of Lake George and Little Lake George. And from there, there's a bend up here. I'm not sure which one it is. You have Palatka. So that's the waterway that the Army had cleared earlier in the first life of the fort, and they had to clear it again during the second life. Fort King was reoccupied by Company D, 4th Infantry. They arrive and construct some new buildings, quarters, a hospital, and even building a boat to bring supplies by waterway. Not sure, if they're having to reconstruct the entire fort. I think it may have been burned. There's no surgeon at Fort King, so it's Lieutenant William Graham commanding the post. He has to hire a temporary civilian as the surgeon, And Lieutenant Graham, he's also promoted to captain. He appoints Erastus Rogers, or he contracts Erastus Rogers to be the post sutler, which he will be in that position for 3.5 years before he's killed by Osceola's warriors. Officers of the post, see if I have that, are commanding the post First Lieutenant William Graham, who's promoted to captain at about the same time. Brevet Second Lieutenant Bradford Alden, and Acting Sergeant John Hamilton. John Hamilton's actually not a Army surgeon, he's a contracting surgeon, so he'll eventually be dropped. Company D, 4th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Graham, left Fort Brooke, Florida on the 12th of July and arrived and reoccupied Fort King. On the 18th July, in obedience to Order 49 from Adjutant General's Office, dated 7th June 1832, and that's what's written right in the middle of the post returns. So you can always get some valuable information from the monthly post returns, and now they're all on Ancestry.com. So if you look on Ancestry, you can see the whole collection of post returns up to 1906. There's 42 men on the post here. Also listed on special duty under the officers is Captain James Hook, he'll be known as Major Hook. He's off doing duty in Washington, D.C. He's serving as Assistant Commissary General of Subsistence in Washington. He never came to Fort King since he is appointed to the position in Washington in 1829, but he's been unofficially serving in that position since 1821. Captain Hook originally commanded at Fort Hawkins, Georgia, which is near Macon, Georgia. You can see a reconstructed Fort Hawkins today. But Captain Hook suffered a crippling injury, broke his back, which bothered him the rest of his life. He could not walk unaided. So he was given the job in subsistence where he would not be in the field. It's ironic that he shows up for 1 month on the Fort King return, because Fort King is also closely associated with Osceola, and James Hook will come in possession of Osceola's clothing and personal items in 1838 that will be given to him as a present or appreciation from Dr. Frederick Whedon and Captain Pitcairn Morrison. Another aside, besides plundering Osceola's personal items, Captain Morrison will later be partially responsible for the Bascom affair in Arizona in 1861, where the Lieutenant Bascom tries to shake down Chief Cochise for taking a boy from one of the ranches. Cochise didn't do it and didn't know who did it at the time, but that will start 25 years of warfare with the Apache. So, very, very dark history associated with that officer. These items of Osceola probably could have been stuff that Osceola had with him at Fort King. There are several adjutant letters from Captain William Graham arguing that he should have been promoted ahead of James Hook because Graham has more seniority in the Army. Major Hook's in Washington. He'll be in charge of subsistence, of feeding all the native tribes being removed under the Indian Removal Act. And at the same time, he'll amass a huge collection of Native American artifacts and clothing from all over the country, something that was considered very common during the 18th century, but today would be very questionable and unethical. When Major Hook dies, probably from his injuries in 1841, his wife will sell his collection for the money, and the Osceola items will be purchased by Captain John Casey, who's serving as the Indian agent in Tampa at Fort Brooke until Captain Casey dies in 1856. It's my belief that he may have given some of those items back to Billy Bowlegs because Captain Casey was very good friends with Billy Bowlegs. So Anyway, this post returns for July 1832. In August 1832, Second Lieutenant Joseph Harris joins the post, serves as subsistence officer. Lieutenant Alden's working on a boat and finishing the quarters. Dr. Hamilton's dropped and returns because he's not a commissioned officer. You only have one company here at the post at the time. Assistant Sergeant John Thurston joins the post in September 1832. There are 35 men present with 4 desertions and 2 apprehensions. So basically half a company size, 4 desertions, that's like over 10% of your men deserting. They only caught 2 of them. Where do you go? They either go 100 miles down to Fort Brooke, which, if they show up there in partial uniform, you know, can't, can't hide in Tampa very easily because, Tampa wasn't that large a community at that time. Or they can go north to Micanopy and in that community, but that's a very small community too. And so in a few months later, in December 1832, Captain Graham's summoned to attend a civil court in Noonanville. 3 soldiers who are deserted and are apprehended. January 1833, Captain Graham is back. Assistant Sergeant James Roper replaces Sergeant Thurston. 1 soldier died, no names or details given, 37 soldiers still present. In March 1833, Sergeant Roper is ordered to New Orleans to take an exam in front of the medical board to pass his medical board exam. 1 soldier is deserted and apprehended. Next month, April 1833, Captain Graham and Lieutenant Alden are the officers at the post with 35 men present. Next month in May 1833, Lieutenant Alden takes the boat to Palatka for subsistence and quartermaster stores. During the summer, Sergeant Roper, he goes to Harper's Ferry, Virginia. By July 1833, Captain Graham is the only officer at the post. Lieutenant Alden's left for West Point, probably to become an instructor there. There's 44 men at the post. August, there's 54 men at the post, so almost a full company. In October 33, Sergeant Roper, who's not yet returned to Florida, he goes to New York for another examination. Medical board headed up by Surgeon Thomas Lawson, who will soon after become the Army Surgeon General. Lawson has a history of being in Florida, who was the surgeon with the 7th Infantry at Fort Scott and Camp Recovery in 1818 to 1821, where he got in a fist fight with the commanding officer, Matthew Arbuckle. That's another story. I may have mentioned that in the past. 1 soldier died at Fort King, 52 men present. November 1833, Captain Graham present, Sergeant Roper returns after being gone for 8 months, 44 men present. And January 1834, Sergeant Roper is listed as sick, 42 men present. Next month, Sergeant Roper is still sick. Next month after that, in March 1834, Sergeant Roper dies of pulmonary consumption. So I guess a heart attack. What a waste. After sending him through all those boards examination, he comes back to Fort King and dies. Not very good for Fort King when the surgeon comes back and dies. Okay, April 1834. First time since August, a full company of soldiers, except for the officers. Captain Graham is the only officer present, which shall remain for a while until November 1834, after about, was it 7 months or so, Captain Graham finally gets his relief in November 1834 when he's joined by Lieutenant John Graham. and Surgeon General Clark. I think Surgeon General Clark will die during the war in 1839, if I remember correctly. Uh, Captain William Graham and Lieutenant John Graham. The two Grahams, they're not related. They just have the same last name. But William Graham's brother is James Graham, who will become famous up in the old Northwest as an Army engineer. At the same time, the Army is Indian agencies have a negotiation with the Seminoles. I think that happened around October 1834 to try pressure them to remove. The talks went basically nowhere and ended badly for the United States. Well, ended badly for everyone. They'll resume their talks in March. We'll get to that in a moment. December 1834, with the United States trying to pressure the Seminoles to remove. Brevet General Duncan Clinch will arrive and assume command of the post, adding Company D, 2nd Artillery, with the already present Company D. Also added our Dr. Waitman as Sergeant, Captain Drain, who Lieutenant, or Fort Drain is named after. I think it's Captain Gustavus Drain. Lieutenant R. Smith with a total of 90 men. 5 other lieutenants and 1 sergeant are absent on duty elsewhere. In January 1835, Lieutenant F.A. Dancy takes command from Captain Drain. Captain Drain goes to St. Augustine for ordnance duty. Lieutenant Dancy, he's only there for like a month, but he will eventually resign from the Army and he'll become a famous engineer around St. Augustine area. February 1835, Captain Drain returns, probably from Fort Drain. 70 men are at the Fort King. March 1835, there are now 6 companies at Fort King, with talks of the Seminoles are held at the Indian Agency, and the government will pressure the Seminoles to remove. Brigadier General Clinch is commanding, Major Fanning and 3 surgeons, 15 lieutenants and captains, 245 men present for duty, 2 desertions and 1 apprehension. There's 6 companies at the fort at this time. The talks will end badly again with Wiley Thompson patronizing the Seminoles, talking down, saying, you're acting like children, not removing. The white men will act badly to you. And the Indians say, we saw Oklahoma, we like it better here. And the talks will fall apart. And Wiley Thompson, Indian agent, he'll be shocked as when the Seminoles leave, when they are paid their last annuities. They are told that's the last ones they'll get. They cash it in at the sutler's store for gunpowder. So that's an obvious sign of things to come. April 1835, General Clinch departs and Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Fanning assumes command. This is April 1835. Captain Drain's Company D, 2nd Artillery, with Lieutenant Waitman, leaves to Fort Marion in St. Augustine. Lieutenant Constantine Smythe is now at the post. He will be killed at the end of the year. Also at the post are Lieutenant Charles Mellon and Lieutenant Maitland, who will also be killed in the Second Seminole War. Lieutenant Mellon will be killed at the Battle of Lake Monroe, or Camp Monroe, Fort Mellon, in February 1837. Lieutenant Maitland will be wounded at the Battle of Wahoo Swamp, while he's sent up north to recover, I think, a boat off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. He'll get about with dementia and jump out and drown. Lieutenant John Graham is commanding a boat party bringing in subsistence stores from Payne's Landing. 211 men present at the post. May 1835, Lieutenant Colonel Fanning's commanding, the same number of officers have gone to the local plantation known as the Flotards, named after a man named Flotard, 12 miles away. And that'll be, I guess, I think that's going to be one of the camps that General Gaines will camp at. Lieutenant Prince mentions that. 186 men present at the post. Things steadily go downhill with relations to the Seminoles. There will be an instance in, next month in June, but believe it, maybe at the end of May, Osceola will go in and have sharp words with Wiley Thompson and basically tell him, this land is ours and you need to be gone, so get out of here. Thompson will be indignant and lock up Osceola for, I think, about a week until some of the chiefs will get together and negotiate a release. Uh, Osceola will promise to bring in his people and surrender and immigrate to Indian Territory. And Wiley Thompson's so overjoyed with that he will buy a fancy Spanish rifle for Osceola in Savannah with a lot of gilding on, and will be the rifle that Osceola will kill Thompson with about 6 months later. In June 1835, Lieutenant Colonel Fanning's commanding 2 surgeons, 9 officers, 4 companies, 153 men present. 1 desertions. Also in June, there's an incident in Alachua County. I think it's called Blue Sink, where the settlers will find some Seminoles cooking one of their cows on a pond and get in a gunfight. And one of the Seminoles will be killed, and they'll whip some of the others. And a couple months later, the Seminoles or the Miccosukes, will take their revenge. July 1835, Colonel Fanning still commanding, 10 officers, 255 men at the post. August 1835, Lieutenant Fanning still commanding, 284 men at the post. So steadily getting more soldiers here. And also in August, the mail carrier from Fort Brooke will be waylaid and killed and body dumped in a pond. It's believed in revenge for the Seminole warrior who was killed back the previous June. That will be, gosh, what's the name? Anyway, I should have written that down. Anyway, going along, number of soldiers at the post in October 1835, 279 soldiers. November 1835, Lieutenant Colonel Fanning's still commanding, Sergeant Clark present, 12 officers, 6 companies, 290 soldiers. I think this will be about the most at the post at one time. 1 died, 3 desertions, 4 deserters apprehended. So they caught one that had been hanging around from the previous month. 4th Infantry Company D detached to go to Wetumpka, that's Fort Drane, Colonel Clinch's plantation. 50 recruits have been ordered to Fort King. Several officers have resigned their commission at the time. It's noted at the bottom of the post return. In December 1835, as the war starts, Lieutenant Constantine Smythe, he writes out his resignation. He decides that he wants to resign to the Army and do whatever in civilian life. He writes that out the same day that he is killed on December 28th. In the morning, all the companies depart Fort King for Clinch's plantation, Fort Drane, except for 1 company, 3rd Artillery, 12 sick men, and a hospital steward staying behind Fort King, and 4 soldiers in confinement. Lieutenant Ichabod Crane is coming into the post from St. Augustine, I think. Yes, that's the same Ichabod Crane that Washington Irving writes about in Sleepy Hollow. Washington Irving borrowed the name of his former commanding officer because he must have thought that was a silly name. He'll use that in a novel. Ichabod Crane assumes command with 46 men in the garrison in the afternoon. They arrive just after Lieutenant Constantine Smythe and Indian Agent Wiley Thompson are killed by Osceola's warriors, along with the post sutler Erasmus Rogers, two of the store clerks. I think one is a boy, and Mr. Suggs and Mr. Kitzler are killed. And so the Second Seminole War has begun on the same day. Major Dade is wiped out. Uh, Colonel Ichabod Crane is commanding with Surgeon Clark and three officers, only 47 men at the post in January 1836. They're pretty much in isolation. Seminoles have cut off communication down to Fort Brooke. Two men in the hospital from wounds from the Battle of Withlacoochee. 10 previous left in the hospital, and 3 men are confined. The Battle of Withlacoochee, 3 days after Major Dade was killed on the Withlacoochee River, those soldiers that went to Fort Drane, and some of them came back to Fort King, put in the hospital there. And on January 6th, the officer Joseph Harris, Lieutenant Joseph Harris, he writes a letter to the War Department saying, the Indians with Coochie, one of them dropped a soldier's backpack, and we're kind of wondering where it came from. And oh, by the way, we haven't heard from those soldiers that are supposed to come here from Fort Brooke yet, and we kind of fear the worst. So he's not saying what he's fearing, which is, of course, Major Dade's men wiped out. February, this post return from February, Colonel Crane commanding, Post Surgeon Clark, 4 officers, assigned to the post, only 52 men at the post in the garrison, including 2 hospital stewards. 19 are sick in the hospital, including those soldiers brought from Fort Drane, and 6 in confinement. General Gaines arrives on the 26th and leaves behind 2 officers, and General Gaines also leaves behind 34 men of the Louisiana volunteers who are sick. So basically, you have 53 men are sick inside the hospital at Fort King, which is one more than the garrison of the post. 52 men make up the garrison. Probably some of those are sick. March 1836, not there yet, but Captain Lemuel Gates assumes command with the surgeon and 2 lieutenants, 50 men in the garrison, still 2 men in the hospital. Lemuel Gates was a very popular young officer, and he will die a few months later, I believe, at Fort Micanopy from disease contracted in Florida. And this month, April 36, 1836, the last month before Fort King is abandoned, Captain Gates, Lemuel Gates, with 49 men in the garrison, 2 in the hospital. General Clinch passes by with 1,100 troops heading to Fort Drane. Fort King is abandoned on May 27th for 11 months. The garrison moves to Fort Drane, which is soon abandoned, and then they go up to Micanopy after that. Captain Lemuel Gates gets sick and dies from disease August 6th at Fort Defiance, which is Fort Micanopy's first activation. So that is the second period of Fort King. And so it will be abandoned for about 8 months, and then it will be reoccupied. In the meantime, it will be burned, most likely from the Seminoles. And then you'll get the modern, or the latter type of Fort King that we're kind of familiar with from John T. Sprague's artwork, and that they're trying to rebuild in Ocala. So they got the walls and the pickets and the blockhouse there. They just rebuilt the blacksmith shop. So, but anyway, that's enough for now. I'll continue on in part 3 of Fort King, and thank you for watching.